Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, Chapter 9, Halacha 5, and if you're following along in the art scroll, we're on page 76A1. Now we're going to talk about Beur, and we're going to talk about some of the things that can be used for Beur. Keep in mind when we're talking about grasses are used as animal food. One of the other things that's going to be coming up is going to be something that the Yerushalmi pays a lot of attention to. That's going to be mixtures. What do you do with mixtures and nullification when things get mixed together? So in the case that's going to be coming up, what's going to happen when you're going to take grasses, which are going to be animal food, and it has Sheviis, and then you're going to mix it with plaster? What do? One of the things with plaster and hay together, that's going to be something that you're using for a person. You're going to be using it to make a house and for human habitation. So, that's going to be something, you have this animal food over there, you have Sheviis sanctity over there, but you are going to be upgrading it. What's going to happen when you mix something like that together? The Mishnah starts off and it says, "One who gathers fresh grasses and stores them may consume them freely without Beur until the ground dries up. And at that point, the fresh, moist grasses are no longer available in the field, and therefore they can be kept in the house and subject to Beur." Again, these grasses, this is going to be animal food. So the Mishnah continues again, and it says, "One who gathers grasses, dry grasses, and stores them may consume them freely until the second rains fall." Now, this idea of the second rains falling is going to come up many times in this halacha. And the idea is that after this point of the second rains falling, the dried grasses are no longer available to the beasts of the field, and they're going to be subject to Beur. Basically, the first rains are going to come sometime around Sukkot in Eretz Yisrael. The second rains we're only talking about in the land of Israel. And sometime after Sukkot, you get these heavy rains, and within a day or two with these very, very heavy rains, any dried grasses that you had or dry straw is going to get mildew and start to rot, and it won't even be suitable to feed to animals anymore. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, "Fresh leaves of reeds and fresh leaves of grapevines may be stored away and consumed freely until they fall from their branches, at which point they are subject to Beur." Now, these can be other leaves. So in particular, the grapevine leaves are going to be where they're going to take them, they're going to cure them in vinegar or salt water, and then they are going to wrap them with rice and maybe some olive oil, and they are going to pickle them and store them. And it's a common dish in Turkish food and in Greek food, and presumably here back in that time as well. You can still get that food readily available in this part of the world. It is still eaten, and it is quite good. And you're going to come up with other kinds of leaves that we discussed earlier in Masechet Sheviis, like we're learning the time of Beur for these grape leaves that are a food source in this area of the world. And the idea is that once the grape leaves fall off, that's when you have to take even these pickled grape leaves and even these leaves that are now wrapped up with rice and put them out. You're not allowed to hold them anymore. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, "One who gathers dry leaves may store them and use them until the second rains fall, whereupon they become subject to Beur." Now, when the second rains fall, the dry leaves out in the fields are going to start to rot and decompose, and it's going to be inedible. Even goats aren't going to eat it. And because they are no longer available in the fields, they're going to have to be removed from the house. So there's a dissenting view about that. Rabbi Akiva says, in all of these cases, basically regarding both the grasses or the leaves, And by the way, whether it's going to be fresh or dry, Rabbi Akiva says that the produce may be used until the second rains fall, at which point it is subject to Biur. So Rabbi Akiva is saying that whether it's going to be moist or dry grass, it's not going to be viewed as a separate species. And as long as any grasses at all, whether moist or dry, are going to be there in the field, you're going to be allowed to have any stored grasses, and it's going to be permitted. And that's not going to be subject to Beur. But when this second rain falls, and it's going to be a very, very big rain that's really going to be like the start of the season. It's not the first rain. In the first rain, it might be very, very light. But the second rain in Eretz Yisrael is going to be very heavy. And this is going to cause all that stuff to basically leave the field. It's not going to be suitable as food anymore. And it's going to start to rot. And the Chazan Ish says about this, since dried grasses and leaves remain in the field until the second rainfall. In other words, it's not enough for the first rainfall to cause this to start to decay. Chazan Ish says it is the Biur time for all leaves and grasses, even those that are fresh, because again, the other ones are leaving the field. The Mishnah now is going to talk about other examples about the legal significance of the second rainfall. Mishnah says, similarly, if someone rents a house to his fellow until the rains, it is rented until the second rains fall. So if you have a rental agreement that says until the rains, the owner may not evict the tenant until the time of the second rainfall. This, by the way, is going to be the 23rd of Marchavan. This is going to be where this is the approximate date of when this is going to happen. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say that one who vows to prohibit benefit from his fellow until the rains remains prohibited until the second rains fall. And this is a case where the Mishnah is talking about a case where the person vowed a neder prohibiting benefit from his fellow, but stipulated in this neder that it remains in effect only until the rains. And because he used the plural word of rains, the neder is going to remain valid until the second rainfall. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, until when may the poor enter the orchards? And the answer is going to be until the second rains fall. This is what the Mishnah says. So once the second rains arrive, the new crop begins to sprout, and it can be damaged by those who walk around in the fields. Therefore, from that point on, one is forbidden to enter the field of someone else to go retrieve these gifts, because he may come to trample the newly sprouted shoots. And that's not to say that the people are no longer entitled to the produce, by the way. They are entitled to produce. The Mishnah is simply denying them free access to the fields, and the owner has to bring the produce to them. And he has to do that or either give him a non-damaging way to enter the field, or has to actually bring it to them. They're still entitled to the gifts, but he's allowed to keep them out to keep them from damaging the field. Let me read that again because it's very important. It says, until when may the poor enter the orchards? And again, this idea is going to be that this is going to be to gather leket, shkika, peah in a non-Sheviis year, and also in the Sheviis year or during the 8th year. So this has a lot of use here. And the Mishnah is using the term of the poor, and that's going to support this idea that it's even available for leket, shkika, and peah, where that is actually going to be gifts for the poor. Now, the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, from when may we derive benefit from and burn chopped and whole straw of Sheviis? And it says, from when the second rains fall. So this is going to be, what happens if you have perhaps chopped straw from an earlier season, and maybe it's even a few years later. That's what this Mishnah is going to be talking about. And then it's going to say from the second rain. In other words, the primary use of straw is going to be for animal food, and it's going to be subject to Sheviis sanctity, and that means that you're not allowed to destroy it. So the question is going to be, what is it? What's the point? And the question is, at what point does this even get lifted? And in other words, one is permitted to burn this produce as fuel, or even get benefit from the destruction, like by mixing it with plaster, or even using it for bedding and putting it into a pillow. So the question really is being asked in this Mishnah, and saying, at what point can you start to use this straw for other uses? And when it's talking about burning it, it's going to be for fuel. In other words, it's going to be good for getting a larger fire started. And the Gemara is going to start to go over this, and it's going to talk about the Beur deadline for the leaves of the reeds and the leaves of the grapevines. And Rabbi Avin says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, there is actually no mention here of leaves of reeds, but only of leaves of grapevines, for leaves of reeds are not subject to Beur. So this is going to get an explanation in a second, because that seems like a big Hiddush. And the Gemara supports this assertion that the leaves of reeds are not going to be subject to Beur. And so the Gemara says that it was taught in a brisa, leaves of reeds, leaves of sumac, leaves of carob are not subject to Beur, because these species do not ever disappear from the field. So the idea is, says the Rosh Cirilio, that the leaves of these species, even after they fall from the tree, do not crumble and rot, but they dry out, and they are going to remain edible forever for these animals like goats. And because they're always available to the beasts of the field, they're not ever going to be subject to Beur. So even if it fell off the ground, the Hiddush here is, even if it falls, you don't see it on the carob tree anymore, and it falls from the ground, these three leaves are special because they don't actually rot with the rains. That they're still there, and animals can still graze on them. It's not going to decompose in the same way. That's, I think, what the Hiddush here is. And that's why this is a little bit different than what we saw earlier here about the leaves of carobs. The mechanism here is going to be that these leaves of reeds are never subject to Beur because they just dry out. They don't actually rot. The Mishnah is ruling that, and by the way, this is, again, something that's going to be available to animals. So even though you might not be getting any benefit from these three kinds of leaves that dry out, the animals that forage do, and they never actually leave the field. In other words, there's so much available, and they never actually rot or decay, that you're always going to have it there, and it's always going to be in a case where it's not subject to Beur. Now, the Mishnah rules that if a person rents a house until the rains and stipulates that his vow should remain in effect until the rains, it is assumed that he intended the second rainfall. And now the Gemara is going to teach an exception to this rule. So what is going to be the exception of the rule? Rabbi Zera says in this Gemara, and says, if one stated in a vow or a rental agreement until the rain. Now, by the way, until the rain, this is written in the singular, okay? It doesn't say until the rains. The Gemara says it is understood to mean until a single rainfall. In other words, what Rabbi Zera is saying, because this is in the singular, this is just marking the first rainfall of the year. In Eretz Yisrael, you have a very peculiar season here where it will not rain for a long period of time right after Pesach up until right about Sukkot, generally the first or the last day of Sukkot. And then there will be a large second rain that comes right after Sukkot, that's going to be substantial. It's going to happen even a few days after Sukkot, or maybe a week or two after. But generally, you have a very distinct dry season and a very distinct rainy season. And in all the years that I've been here in Eretz Yisrael, in the late springtime and certainly in the summertime, I have never seen or heard of it rain. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a similar ruling, and we learned in a Mishnah there in Shekalim 6:4. It says, "If one says, 'It is upon me to bring pieces of wood for the altar,' he may not bring less than 2 blocks of wood." Now, this again is getting into the same idea. If you're bringing blocks of wood for a Tamid offering to dedicate to the temple, and you're saying, "I'm bringing pieces of wood," again, that is in the plural. How many pieces of wood do you use in the Tamid? There are 2, and in fact, we mention that every morning in our prayers. There are 2 blocks of wood. So, this is not being mentioned in the singular. This is being mentioned in the plural. But what happens now if it is going to be used in the singular form? Is that going to be a case where you bring 1 piece of wood, even though the Tamid is going to require 2 pieces of wood? And the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, if this is talking about the Mishnah, if one says, "It is upon me to bring pieces of wood for the altar," he may not bring less than 2 blocks of wood. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Bun, says in the name of Rabbi Ba Bar Mamel, and says, if one says, "It is upon me to bring wood," using the singular form, he brings only a single block, according with the wording of his vow. Now, here too, this vow is being talked about from Rabbi Zera until the rain. This is now talking about the singular form, and this now is being taken as evidence to show the intention that no, he's only talking about the first rain sometime around the season holiday of Sukkot, and it might be maybe the first day, maybe the last day, but somewhere in there. It's not talking maybe the week after or 2 weeks after that. So you can get pretty clear on a normal season here in Eretz Yisrael. This, by the way, is not going to apply for outside of Eretz Yisrael because the weather patterns are going to be less defined. So, or not as relevant. So the Gemara is going to continue, and Rabbi Lazar says, a Mishnah said this concerning 2 blocks of wood that are bought with a Tamid offering, and that this block is an independent offering, and that block is an independent offering, and we learned in a Mishnah that describes the bringing of the afternoon Tamid, that 2 Kohanim hold in their hands 2 blocks of wood for the altar. Now, since each block of wood is going to be carried and offered by a separate Kohen, it is clearly regarded as an independent offering, and it's following that someone who undertakes to bring a single block of wood has uttered a valid vow. In other words, if you are doing the same thing as what Rabbi Zera is saying, and Rabbi Zera, by the way, is clarifying also this Mishnah over there in Shekalim, that this is basically going to be a valid vow because he used it in the singular, and he knew he used it in the singular. Now, if you used it in a regular way and it didn't specify the singular, then it's going to be where you have to either do it to the second rain or, in the case of the Tamid, bring 2 blocks of wood. Now, the Mishnah is stating that when a person stipulates that his vow should stay in effect until the rains, it is going to be valid until this second rainfall. Now, the Gemara is going to continue and teach a Baraisa. Rabbi Yosei says, with regard to any matter that is contingent upon the arrival of the actual rain, the law is in effect until the second rains actually fall. But with regard to that which is not contingent upon the actual arrival of the rain, the law is in effect until the time of the second rainfall arrives. Now, this Gemara is trying to tell us that the rain does not necessarily need to fall. Rather, all that depends upon what the stipulation was meant to accomplish. Rather, when the stipulation was intended to ensure that the rain will not affect someone's ability to fulfill the vow, we assume that the person meant that the vow be contingent upon the actual arrival of the rain. For example, and this, by the way, comes up with the Mara Fulda, a person goes and vows not to derive benefit from shoes until the arrival of the rain. Now, this is implicit that he wishes to avoid the difficulty of walking in the rain without shoes. So therefore, in that case, we can actually assume that this neder remain in effect until the actual rain comes and fall. But the nuance here is that the stipulation has no direct connection to this prohibition and is simply an arbitrary point at which time to end this neder. One does not, where somebody doesn't even vow to derive benefit until the rains fall. We can assume that the vower is not talking about actual rainfall, but actually to a point of time where it is going to be usual for the rain to fall. And this, by the way, is going to be whether it's going to be like around the Sukkot time or about a week after Sukkot. Again, the weather pattern in Israel is very, very defined. So the nuance here is that this is trying to say that if you're making a vow and it actually is dependent upon the rain, so like you have shoes and you don't want to walk around barefoot without this, and the neder would deal with actual rain and use of shoes so your feet would not get cold and wet, then that would actually be a vow where you actually have to have rain take place. But if it is not something that is general with regards to rain, then it's talking about a general time frame. And so even if the rain is a little bit late, you would still be up in the time for your release. Now, we were talking about the subject of rainfall, and the Gemara is going to talk about barises that are going to teach Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's views on this matter. Here's the first of these barises. The Gemara says, they taught in a barisa, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, when there are 7 days at the beginning of the rainy season on which rains fall without stopping, they encompass the second rainfall as well as the first. So this is talking about a case where the first rainfall begins on the regular day and it continues to rain and rain and rain and it goes for 7 consecutive days. Now, the final day of the 7 days of this rainfall, this is going to be the first day of the second rain period. So the Barisa's point is that although the rain was continuous and there was no end to it, we can still judge that there are 2 separate periods of the rainfall. One is going to be where it started, and it's going to be on the very, very last day. So if a person stipulates that his vow should end at the rainfall, he's going to be exempted from his vow for the second rainfall is deemed to have arrived. So there's, by the way, going to be a couple of opinions on this, and I just want to clarify this. So Rabbi Meir is going to say that in general in Eretz Yisrael, the first rainfall is going to begin on the 3rd of March Shvan, and the second is going to begin on the 7th of March Shvan, and the final rainfall is going to begin on the 23rd. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that the starting dates for the 3 periods are going to be the 7th, 17th, and 23rd of March Shvan. And Rabbi Yosei, who has the third opinion, is going to hold that the 2 opinions, the 2 periods of rain are going to begin respectively on the 17th and 23rd, at which point the third period is going to begin actually on the 1st of Kislev. So that's going to be the opinion. The second barisa that was taught in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Rabbi Hia taught a barisa in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and says, why is the rainfall called by the name of Revi'ah? Revi'ah is going to have this connection of entering into something, and it's going to say because the rain penetrates the earth. In other words, that the rain is going to go into the earth and penetrate the earth and actually go pretty deep into the earth. So this is not talking about a light drizzle that just sort of goes on the surface. This is talking about something that actually is going to make the ground moist and wet and is going to actually influence the quality of the earth. It's not just going to sort of just evaporate away, but it's going to change it to where the ground now has moisture. So the Mishnah stated that from when may we derive benefit from and burn chopped straw and the whole straw of Sheviis, and it's going to say from the second, from the time the second rains fall. Now, again, keep in mind, when we're talking about the straw, we are talking about animal food and all of the laws that come up from that. So we're going to get into the rationale behind the Mishnah's ruling here. Rabbi Hanania says, once that which is in the field rots, that which is in the house is permitted. In other words, it no longer possesses Sheviis sanctity, and you can burn it. And the straw in the field begins to rot after the second rainfall, and therefore, from that time, we are permitted to burn the straw of Sheviis. And by the way, other uses as well. You can use it to make bedding. You can use it to make pillows. You could use it to stuff things like dolls for children. But the point is that now it doesn't have Sheviis sanctity. It has left the field. And what's interesting is now that it's in your house and you own it. So that's the wrinkle here. That's what's interesting and nuanced here. So Rabbi Hanania is explaining that this applies not only to the actual produce that is rotted, but once the rains come, even the produce that is still in the house. And that's what's so interesting about it. So we have to understand, well, what exactly would be this mechanism where it's no longer in the field, but now you have it in the house, and now you're basically getting ownership of this non-Sheviis produce that's in your house. And the idea is that because you do have a lot of Sheviis restrictions, and by the way, you're not allowed to destroy Sheviis produce or you're not allowed to sell it commercially, the answer is that it still is going to be hefker. It's going to be ownerless. And the idea is that at some point where Beur comes, it has to be made available to anyone who wishes to take it. So because the produce is essentially hefker, someone who stores it away for personal use acquires it with a limited right of ownership. And basically he's granted the right to eat the Sheviis produce or to use it like for his animal food, but he doesn't have the right to destroy it. In other words, he can't go and use it to light the fire of his house. And we see that Sheviis prohibitions deriving from the hefker status of food, and so the same would be with the Beur obligation. So effectively what's happening is that in a way it seems like the person's courtyard or house is effectively acquiring. In other words, the time for Beur comes, it's in a guy's house, and when it was subject to Beur, the Sheviis sanctity basically goes away because it's rotted. It's no longer available in the field for any animals to eat. But you still have it in your house. Up until that point, you could have fed it to your goats or your donkeys. And now that it left the field, effectively, I think what this is arguing, similar to Chapter 9, Halacha 4, is that your courtyard is effectively acquiring it for you because it is being put out to hefker. And so even if you didn't make the declaration, nonetheless, the Sheviis sanctity has exited from it. Now, the Mishnah is ruling that where the second rainfalls arrive, one is allowed to consume the straw in the fields that has begun to rot. And the Gemara is going to state otherwise. Rabbi Hoshaya says in a brisa, even after 3 years, it is prohibited to burn straw of Sheviis until one is certain it is rotted. In other words, that the Sheviis sanctity can carry on for years, and you have to be certain that it is rotted. And one of the one of the other cases here is going to be where Rabbi Hoshaya could be talking about fields in mountainous places that do not absorb water very well. And these areas could be dry even after a rain period because the rain sort of evaporates away very quickly or runs off in these mountainous areas. And so straw that's going to be in these areas are not going to decompose very quickly. And so you have to be very certain that the straw that you have from these places actually did rot. And so until you're clear that this actually did rot, you're not allowed to get rid of what is in your house. In other words, it's effectively still going to be in the field even after 3 years. And effectively, the animals may not have even grazed on all of it still. And that effectively, you didn't get rid of it. And so because it's still in the field, by the way, there's no contradiction from our earlier sugya. Because it's still effectively in the field, and what this is trying to point out is that we're perhaps talking about a stony mountainous area that, you have a lot of water runoff. It doesn't rot. Well, the Sheviis sanctity is going to still be there because this straw is still going to be in the field. And so because it's still in the field, even though it's in your house, you didn't get rid of the Sheviis sanctity, so you can't go use it to make your pillows, you can't use it to make your bedding, you can't burn it. You still have to use it in a way where you have to feed it to your goats. You're not allowed to destroy it. Now, there's going to be another teaching, and this is, in a way, going to be a little bit more interesting. This is getting into what happens now where you're taking the straw and you're effectively creating a mixture. Now, the Mishnah was talking about chopped straw of Sheviis, and the Gemara says, with regards to chopped straw of Sheviis, we may not soak it in plaster because it causes it to be destroyed. And the Gemara says, however, if one did soak it and mix it in plaster, the straw is nullified and is therefore permitted for use, provided one kneaded it into the plaster. This is a big hiddush. And the Mara Fulda says about this that mixing straw into plaster is a use that lends to the produce being destroyed because once it's placed in the plaster, the straw decomposes. By the way, it does really strengthen your plaster, though. So the idea is that it's going to be forbidden to cause the destruction of edible Sheviis produce. You can still feed it to your animals. And although placing the straw into the plaster is not going to be allowed once it is done, one is permitted to make use of the plaster and the straw, provided that the straw has been kneaded into the plaster. So when you have the two that are going to be thoroughly mixed together, it's going to make this mixture, the straw is going to be nullified by the plaster, meaning that it loses its independent identity. And therefore, it's just a mere component of the plaster. And that's what's interesting about it. It's become part of a mixture. And because it's no longer considered food, it ceases to be subject to Sheviis sanctity. Now, keep in mind, you're not really allowed to go do this, but if this was already done, okay, you're allowed to use the straw. It doesn't forbid the plaster from use. Another way to look at this is that, well, if you're making plaster, you're still using it for human habitation. And if you're using it for human habitation, it's still going to be a human use. So there's another nuance that's going on over there. There's going to be a second teaching about this. With regards to the chopped straw of Sheviis, we may not place it into a pillow to serve as stuffing. However, if one did place it into a pillow, it is nullified and therefore permitted for further use, provided that one slept on the pillow. So until the person actually uses the pillow to lie on, it is not turned from a from a food item into a non-food item, and therefore it is prohibited for use other than food. But once you go and you lie on the pillow, you've demonstrated that you're not viewing the straw as food anymore, but as a utensil. And the physical act is enough where you've actually nullified the straw's status as food, and you've transformed it into a non-food. The Chazan Ish says about this that once the produce is transformed into a non-food, the Sheviis prohibitions no longer apply. The Gemara now has a question regarding Sheviis straw. And the Gemara says, concerning chopped straw of Sheviis, which is food for animals only, what is the law with regard to it being prohibited as an aftergrowth of Sheviis? In other words, did the decree of Sefachin include animal food, or is it just dealing with the food for people? Now, that's a big question. And we know that Sefachin was D'Rabbanan. And why did they do the laws of Sefachin? Because they wanted to stop people from illegally planting and cheating. But what about for animal stuff? Is that going to also be included? And the Gemara answers this question. Rabbi Levi of Senebris asked this question to Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda, and he permitted the straw for use. But the Gemara is going to have a dissenting view. Rabbi Zera says that, but I, who do not rely on the rulings of Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda, pose this question of those of the Academy of Karshana. And they said that it has been our custom to place in chopped straw from before the Sheviis year, and when it runs out, we bring from the Sheviis straw that which was mixed into the plaster of the walls, which have been soaked in plaster and permitted for use. Now, the straw that had not been mixed into the plaster, however, would still not be allowed. So, really, what Rabbi Zera is trying to show by asking these sages is we can see that the decree of Sefachim was stated with regards to animal food of Sheviis as well. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about a brisa that's going to support the view of those who are going to allow Sefachin straw of Sheviis. So there are people who say that the animal food for Sefachin basically is going to be allowed. And we saw Rabbi Zera's inquiry where that they had a tradition or a custom. It wasn't even a tradition, but it was a custom that it was not allowed. So Rabbi Yerushalmi says a brisa has stated that this is permitted for they taught in a brisa. Dyers and those who fatten animals may purchase bran. By the way, bran is going to be the husk, and it's not going to be animal food, people food. It's going to be fed for animals. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say from anywhere at all, and they need not be concerned that it may be Sheviis produce. So, really, what Rabbi Yerushalmi is saying about this brisa, they're saying that because you can purchase bran and use that bran to dye or fatten animals and purchase it from anywhere at all, basically they're saying that animal food is not included in the decree of Sefachim. In other words, they're just saying that Sefachim was really a D'Rabbanan rule just for the human food, not for the animal food. Now, the Gemara is going to draw an inference from this brisa. Rabbi Yerushalmi thought to say on the basis of this brisa that it is permitted to purchase bran even from someone who is suspected of violating Sheviis law. So when it is saying in the past brisa, hey, you can purchase bran from anywhere and anyone, that means even a Sheviis merchant. That's what Rabbi Yerushalmi is trying to say. Even so, this person who is suspected of being a Sheviis merchant, you're not allowed to go purchase food from him for human use, but you can purchase the bran from him for animal use. And really what this brisa is teaching is that it can be purchased even from someone who's suspected of violating Sheviis law and engaging in commerce with Sheviis produce, which is not allowed. So this inference is very clever, but it gets rejected. Rabbi Yossi says to him, they stated this permit only where one does not know whether the seller is suspected or not suspected, but if he is definitely suspected, it is forbidden to purchase even animal food from him. So the idea is that, with this rabbinic decree, the rabbis are penalizing these people by denying them customers. And the Chazan Ish says so that they would not benefit from these unlawful activities. Now, the Gemara is going to return to the question of animal food being included in the decree of Sefachim, and we're going to get now a different proof that it is actually forbidden. So Rabbi Shammai, this is, by the way, not the Shammai of Shammai and Hillel fame. This is a Amarah, Rabbi Shammai, who comes up a few times in the Yerushalmi Shas, I believe 2 or 3 times. This Rabbi Shammai says a Mishnah stated that produce used as animal feed is prohibited as sefachim, for we learned in a Mishnah there with regard to fenugreek that falls in a vat of wine, and with regard to fenugreek of the Sheviis year, or fenugreek of Kalayim of the vineyard, or fenugreek that has kedusha, in other words, it's been consecrated. And it says that if there's enough seed and stalks contained and combined to impart flavor into this wine, basically what's going to happen is it's going to make it where it is going to be prohibited for consumption. And we see that although the stalks are going to be food for animals and the wine is going to be basically food for humans, we see that you can have a case where the stalks are going to be one kind of food, animal food, and the other case is going to be human food. Now, I want to point out, because I thought it was very curious, why Dafka they're talking about fenugreek and wine. And it turns out in the ancient Roman world, and Rome in particular, not here, but in ancient Rome, they actually did soak fenugreek into wine to make it a type of drink, and it would give it this smoky sort of flavor. This was popular in the Italian peninsula, particularly at this time and before. This is not food that they were necessarily doing in Eretz Yisrael, but it was something that was to the taste and common of the conqueror at the time. So from the Jewish perspective here, we are just looking at something that is the stock of food for animals being mixed into human food, and whether that's going to be permitted. But this is something that actually did exist in the ancient world. So perhaps the ancient Jews were not necessarily mixing fenugreek into the wine for consumption. It might not have been their taste profile. And also, it seems strange to mix in animal food with human food. But the Roman occupying powers did have that as a drink. They did like it, and it was popular, and it's in the Roman record. So the Gemara now is going to reject this proof, and Rabbi Mana says, interpret this Mishnah as discussing whether the wine is now subject to Sheviis sanctity and going to be forbidden to consume at the Beur deadline. So the question is, now that you've mixed in this fenugreek into the wine, and now you've mixed in something that's supposed to be animal food, the fenugreek, and the seeds and the stalks are fed to goats and donkeys, and generally not really used for human consumption, and the wine certainly is. The question is going to be now, if the wine gets the flavor of the animal food, what's going to be the status? Now, we talked about this in chapter 9, Halacha 4, with the pickles. What's going to be the status if you've mixed one and the other? And what's going to be where you have now 2 different kinds of vegetables in a jar, and you're making pickles. Now you have over here 2 different kinds. You have one that's going to be animal food, and you now have one that's going to be with a wine. What happens now where the flavor of the animal food goes into the wine? It actually becomes, is going to be like a substance. So the question is whether this is going to show that the animal food is going to be subject to sefachim. And so basically what Rabbi Mana replies back to, and he says that you may learn nothing from this Mishnah concerning the prohibition of sefachim. In other words, Rabbi Mana is arguing that, in fact, the Mishnah does not mean to say that flavor imparted by the stalk makes the wine prohibited for consumption, for even the stalk itself is going to be permitted for consumption. Rather, all the Mishnah means to say is that the wine, like the absorbed flavor, is now subject to the laws of Sheviis. And this, by the way, is going to be like what we covered in the last halacha. Basically, we're saying that when the Beur deadline is going to come for the fenugreek stalk, the wine to which it got its flavor is now going to be subject to Beur as well. According to that interpretation, the Mishnah is not talking about the prohibition of sefekim, but really what it's talking about is whether the wine is going to get the characteristic of Biur. And it's not really talking about whether it's going to get animal food status, and the animal food, and we're learning a law about sefekim and animal food. No, it's really talking about more like the pickle jar. That's what Rabbi Manna is pointing out. And according to Rabbi Manna, the Mishnah is trying to say that when wine absorbs the flavor of this fenugreek, it assumes the Sheviis sanctity and it has to be given all the laws of Sheviis. So again, this is not being used as a tool to teach whether animal food is going to be subject to the laws of sefekim or not. And when a person drinks the wine, which is not found to be, and the Gemara says, when a person drinks the wine, is he not found to be wasting animal food of Sheviis, which is not allowed? In other words, since the fenugreek stalks are intended as food for animals, the flavor they impart is regarded as animal feed as well. So when a person drinks the wine, he prevents the flavor of the stalks from being used for its proper purpose. And the feeding of the animals, that's basically what you're supposed to be doing. And in effect, he's wasting the Sheviis flavor, and it should be forbidden. And the Gemara is going to answer that, and it basically says that the Mishnah is explained as discussing animal food that is used for the benefit of a person, which is going to be permitted. So the Vilna Goan says about this that there's no prohibition when a person is going to go consume animal food of Sheviis, and this is not regarded as wasting the food. Why? Because the person is getting use from it. This is also, I want to point out, very agadic. And again, this is not a drink that was common in the Jewish world, but this was a drink that was common in the Roman world, and particularly when you had the Roman conquest here. So I think that, wine is compared to Torah. And I think that, this is really kind of midrashically also speaking about what's happening when you have, Roman influence coming to, the Jewish domain of Torah and trying to influence the Jews to sort of have new ideas and things like that. I think it's not an accident that it's talking about this specific drink and in this specific context. Have a great day, and we're going to get to Halacha 6 tomorrow, which is going to be talking about the time frame for what happens when Biur comes. Have a great day.